Hello everyone, and welcome to ACAL's first professional learning webinar for 2021. Shifting the gaze from the Numerate individual to their Numerate environment. Firstly, on behalf of ACAL and all the wonderful people here today, I acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung language group of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded land I'm living and working. And I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors, elders, and emerging community members. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians and ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, where we're holding our webinar today. This small token of acknowledgement joins in the chorus of acknowledgements being expressed around Australia every day in solidarity with the aims of Australian reconciliation. I'm Liz Gunn, the Victorian Adult Literacy and Basic Education Council's representative on the ACAL committee. I believe that education gains a lot when we shift our focus to look at environmental considerations like the demand and supply of numeracy skills outside classroom and educational policy settings, and the social contexts where adults engage in numeracy practices. I was excited to read the paper by Jeff Evans, Keiko Yasukawa, David Mellows, and Yana Kubashchikova that we shared with you for this webinar workshop today. And I was very thankful to David for suggesting a panel discussion with the authors around the points they've raised in terms of focusing on numerate environments and making those a policy consideration, as opposed to individual people's numerate individuals. David is Principal Teaching Fellow at the Institute of Education, University College London. He has published extensively on adult literacy and numeracy, and along with Anka Grotlushin and Stephen Reeder, David has written an OECD working paper analysing PIAC data on adults with low literacy and numeracy proficiency. Many of you will already know Dr. Keiko Yasukawa, as well as equipping research-informed teachers with theory and practice in her role as lecturer in Applied Language and Literacy Studies at University of Technology, Sydney. Keiko is also engaged with the adult education profession through her leadership roles in the New South Wales and Australian Adult Literacy and Numeracy Councils. We've also got Dr. Jeff Evans joining us here in the audience. Jeff is Reader Emeritus in Adults Mathematical Learning at Middlesex University. And many of you will have read a lot of his extensively published works about numeracy education over the years. Thank you very much, David and Jeff, for rising so early over there in Europe to fit in with our Australian time zones. We really appreciate it. And now, without any further ado, I will hand everyone over to our first panelist, David Mellows, to kick off our panel discussion today.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Really, really interesting to be talking in a different context and people who've got different preoccupations and different ways of locating themselves in. It's very interesting to see. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really sorry that, well, I am really sorry. I'm much sorrier than you are that I'm not there visiting you to talk to you. But we're not. I'm here. You can see, I don't know how good my camera is, but you can see that I'm in the Netherlands. There's snow out the window, just a little bit. It's a church, and those are the first tulips of the season as well. Even though it's snowing here, the Dutch have managed to produce tulips. So we're in very different places, but we're all on Zoom, and therefore we're all in the same room, and we are all at a conference. And I was talking before just about, very brief aside, on Zooms and conferences, and everything's so much easier in Zoom. I have classes and conferences all the time now. You don't have to worry at all. You just turn up on the time and turn it on. You don't have to get the room ready. You don't have to prepare coffee for anybody at all. You don't have to sit there and have a coffee before you go on the stage and feel really hot and sweaty when you get on the stage. And you can wear what you like when you're on the conference. So I think we've got to embrace it. And as Liz says, when we go out to the breakout rooms, we really want to get you to react to what we're going to say, and to come back and with comments, not necessarily with questions, but does this make any sense to you, and how would it help you to frame the work you do? But okay, we'll go on to that. Well, I'm going to talk as quickly as I can through to get this story from PIAC, the International Assessment of Adult Literacy and Numeracy, that's been the OECD program for the last few years. I want to make some observations about the data that we got from that survey and what it might tell us. And I want to ask a question I want to question that data and say, does it really tell us what we think it tells us, i.e. that there's a huge literacy and numeracy crisis in the Western world? Does it really tell us that? And if it doesn't tell us that, what does it tell us? And from that, I'm going to try to get to the idea that really we should be thinking about what is demanded of people rather than what they can do, i.e. what they have to do, what they want to do, not what we think that they want to do. And if we do that, then the idea of thinking about people in an environment, and that environment being the thing which they react to and they interact with, and that they have access to that environment, that allows us then to take the view off the individual and think of this as a societal problem rather than as an individual deficit that we can solve by filling this person up with these skills that we've identified prior. Okay, and then at that point, I'm going to hand over to Keiko, who will explain, theoretically what we mean by this environment, what it's made up of. Don't make that face, Keiko, because you can do that very well. And also exemplify what we mean in terms of numeracy. And I'm not at all a numeracy expert. My background's a language teacher. I've worked in moments the research works with adult literacy, but in connection always with colleagues who work in adult numeracy. So I'm going to hand over for the numeracy connections and those. So let me start with PIAC. I'm not going to talk about PIAC very much. It's the longitudinal, it's the Program of International Assessment of Adult Competencies, run by the OECD. I think it's 2012 and then 2014, 16. There have been various rounds in a lot of countries. About 26 OECD countries were in the first round. And the subsequent rounds haven't really taught us an awful lot more, because we get much more of the same picture, just in different countries. Now, what the PIACs, the headline figures of PIAC, of course, were league tables, as all the OECD things are. And where did countries come on these league tables? And there was a big range. Some of the top European countries were sort of 10 or 11% in this danger range that I'll talk about. Whereas Japan, I think, was in 2% or something, tiny proportions. And then there were other countries, Italy, France, 25%, and other countries even higher, 40, 50%. And these were people who scored at level 1 or below in PIAC. And level 1 or below is the questions that they were unable to answer are really quite simple, very short texts, simple calculations that, at level 1, they weren't able to do. Now, OECD didn't this time set a functional skills level, or a functional literacy, or a functional numeracy level. They didn't say, at this level, we've got a problem. What they didn't say that at all, because the last time they got in quite a lot of trouble, and it was quite controversial to set that level. So they didn't, but obviously everybody assumed level 1 and below is what they essentially mean by functional. Now, let's take a country. Let's take the country here, Netherlands. The Netherlands has got 17 million people. I think it was the second best performing European country in terms of literacy and in terms of numeracy. So a success. And the Dutch they were happy. They were very pleased with themselves and their policies and their programs. And they have, I think it's 11.1% of their population, according to this survey, at or below level 1. Great, well done. Congratulations, the Netherlands. England, I think, was about 15%. And as I say, other countries much higher. France was 25%, Italy was 25%, at or below level 1. So go back to the Netherlands. That means 1.4 million people in the Netherlands can't read or write sufficiently well to function in society. 1.4 million people in an extremely sophisticated country with a complete welfare safety net, very good public schools, very good health system, extremely successful economy, and yet 1.4 million people in there can't do what they need to do, which essentially is what this survey tells us. So then you go back and take other data, and you don't need data for this, we know this from experience. It isn't easy to fill a basic skills course, a literacy course, a numeracy course. We recruit to these courses. We have outreach and programs and awareness campaigns in order to try and get people onto these courses. Now, if 1.4 million people in the Netherlands are struggling because they can't do what they need in order to function, surely some of them would be looking for courses. Surely some of those people, or a large proportion of those people, would be in need of some form of educational support, but they're not. It's difficult to recruit. And then you start to look at the group. Who are these 1.4 million Dutch people? Are they what we'd expect? And there are things that they have in common. But some things, they're more likely to be certain things. They're more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the survey. And they're more likely to come from an immigrant background than the rest of the survey. And they're more likely to be unemployed than the rest of the people in the survey. But more of them are employed than unemployed. 70% of those level 1 and below are in employment. So it isn't a case that those who are at level 1 and below are not working. 70% of them are working. Worryingly, 10% of them have university degrees. Now that may be, I think it's just science degrees, but it might be science degrees, but it could also be old degrees. You know, people who've not studied for a long time and not used these skills for a long time, the skills will decline. So you've got a group there that aren't clamoring for adult education courses and that society's not collapsing. So what's happening? And when you look at what PIEC does, PIEC tests a series of skills and it tests on what people can do. It never asks, do they need to do this? It never asks, why would they need to do this? And it certainly doesn't ask the participant, what do you need to do? So we don't really know particularly well what people actually have to do with their literacy and their numeracy. Now, very briefly, I'm going to talk about some work we did in workplaces where we asked people about their practices, their writing and their use of numbers and their use of numeracy in the workplace. And lots of lovely things, but one thing I think is very relevant here, or two things. One, most of the literate tasks, most of the texts they produced and most of the numeracy work that they did within that office, I was in particular in a cleaning company, most of it was collaborative. They didn't do things alone. They constructed text, they supported each other, they had, they had processes which meant that the texts weren't particularly individual. And the other ways in which it was very social. Small office, lots of chat, lots of people talking to each other and helping. And the other thing they did, a lot of their production and their use of literacy was scaffolded by other programs, computer programs, scaffolded by guides, templates for letters that they had to write or for replies. So there was a lot in that their use of literacy that was social. It wasn't individual. It wasn't down to that person and whether they could do something. It was far more about that social unit. Could that social unit produce enough of these literate texts. And you think in wider terms, where in past times, literacy, numeracy was very apparent in lots of jobs. In many of those jobs, it no longer is because it's been taken over by machines. Supermarkets is always an easy example for me. That cashiers used to have very good mental maths. I presume they don't now because they just beep and pass things on a scanner. So we've removed those skills from that job. We've removed the necessity. Now, obviously, as we know, if you don't use a skill, if you don't use something you've learned, that will decline. Skills decline is something we know about. So we may be in a danger at the moment of, by reacting to a perceived danger of low skills, a perceived danger that our workforces are lacking in the skills to make them competitive in the international job market, etc., etc. We all know the discourse. Maybe within that, we're actually missing something, which is that it's our need for literacy, our need for numeracy is entirely dependent on what we need to and what we want to do with it. And that we can understand as our environment. The idea of a literate environment comes from work in developing contexts, mostly UNESCO work. And it's a very simple observation. They did lots of evaluations of literacy programs in Africa, in developing contexts. And one of the main features was that those programs may be successful, but as soon as the program leaves and then goes back for a visit in a year's time, they discover that nobody's reading. They learned to read and write, but they didn't ever write because there are no books there, and because there's no written communication. There are no letters from a council. There's no computers. There isn't a library. There's not magazines or newspapers. None of these things are culturally part of their world, and therefore, as soon as you leave, there isn't a literate environment. Therefore, there's no demand on literacy. Therefore, people don't read. Therefore, people lose those skills very quickly. Now, if you imagine we take a student and put that student, what's their literate environment? Where are we sending them out from our classes? Is their literate environment supporting them? Are there things that are stopping them access that literate environment beyond the simple ones of decoding, etc., that we'd see from another curriculum? So if we start to look at, rather than what skills do students have, but we start thinking, well, what's the demand on those skills, then perhaps we can design education programs for adults that they actually want to engage with and that they actually feel benefit them, enable them to do the things they want to do, the things they have to do, rather than us deciding beforehand that we already know what skills are missing because they're the ones that we've identified, that other people have and these people don't have, and an attempt to construct a system to give those people skills that they perhaps don't need. And certainly in terms of some of the curriculum that in literacy, I can see the things that they will never need and aren't particularly relevant to their lives, but while at the same time ignoring their practices and ignoring the things that you could build a program upon. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I hope it's been vaguely clear. And Keiko, I hope I've got you to where we needed you to be to carry that on. I look forward to any questions and things in the chat later on. I'll come back and we'll talk more. Keiko.
Okay, thanks, David. And thanks to Liz and the ACAL committee for inviting us to present this webinar. It's nice to see literacy and numeracy colleagues nationally. Very honored to be here. So I'm going to, in this part of the webinar, talk about the Numerate environment. David, Jeff and I, with another colleague, Brian Crease from the UK, we started to consider this notion of the Numerate environment following David's work that he's just spoken to us about. So, you know, in the numeracy world, as many of you would be aware, you know, thinking about a parallel construct for something that has emerged in literacy, like the literate environment, you know, it seemed like an obvious thing to do. But it also made sense as an emergent area in numeracy research itself, because research on numeracy as social practice you know, this is what people do with their mathematical knowledge and skills in a social context. That research has flourished over, you know, more than 3 decades. And researchers like Jean Lave, who studied the everyday mathematical practices in contexts like, you know, grocery shopping or dieting. And there was a group of Brazilian researchers, Nunes, Carraher, Schliemann, and another Carraher, who studied the mathematical practices of Brazilian children and young adults who were earning money in the streets by minding cars in car park or selling stuff, food in street stalls. And these studies all revealed how numeracy practices, you know, what people do with mathematical knowledge and skills, they reflect the purposes, the available tools they have, values and history of the context in which the practices are carried out. So the mathematical operation of, you know, adding up, for example, look very different in the context of, say, you know, approximating calorie intake during meal preparation, or calculating the cost of a customer's purchases in a street stall, and doing sums in a school mathematics test. Because there are differences in the tools that people use. Some people use mental arithmetic when they're, you know, shopping or calculating calorie intake, whereas in school, children are typically expected to use paper and pencil. Well, maybe something a bit more advanced than paper and pencil. Certain, you know, methods are expected, and the degree of precision required will differ, and also the power relations of the people involved in each of these practices will differ in these different contexts. So these and, you know, more recent studies of numeracy practices very clearly established that numeracy practices cannot be separated from the context in which they occur. Now, what we realized when we were contemplating this construct of the Numerate environment was that, well, yes, numeracy practices are inseparable from their context. But, you know, what exactly do we mean by context? And how can we analyze the numeracy learning and development affordances, the opportunities that these contexts produce? So, in a sense, the Numerate environment problematizes, asks questions of the context of numeracy practices. And in doing so, it reveals not only what an individual needs to learn in order to negotiate a numeracy demand, something that they have to be able to do, that they perceive in their life, but also what actual opportunities there are for learning and development in this context. And also what sorts of support resources and possibly barriers are there that facilitate or limit the individual's take-up of this opportunity. So from this perspective, educational programs can't just simply supply knowledge and skills using some sort of predetermined curriculum or training package that we have in Australia that's developed from population surveys such as the PIAC or some wish list from employer groups. We need to examine, you know, as David's already said, the demands that the individuals are actually experiencing and consider how their social environments can better support their learning. So it's a way of moving away from viewing adult numeracy learning as a purely individual responsibility to something that is a social responsibility. We're all responsible for, you know, supporting the numeracy of our, you know, fellow citizens. So the construct of the Numerate environment is based on the examination of the context through 3 different lenses. The first is looking at the demands that a social practice may make on the adult. It may be shopping, it may be figuring out the infection levels of COVID-19, whatever it is. What are the demands that are placed on an individual? What are the opportunities that that social practice may offer to the adult engaged in it? And then thirdly, what are the supports or resources offered to facilitate? Or conversely, what are the barriers that impede the adult's take-up of the opportunity to learn and develop? And by examining the context of numeracy practices through these 3 lenses, we can gain greater insight into how the context affords, or not, the learning and development of numeracy practices. Excuse me. Now, another sort of rationale for the consideration of the Numerate environment came from Cara Jackson in the US, Alan Rogers in the UK, and myself, when we were reflecting on a range of recent studies of numeracy practices. It led us to recognize that, you know, we talk about context, but context, any context, is rarely fixed and stable. There's fluidity and instability in many contexts of numeracy practices. So the construct of the Numerate environment enables us also to examine how changes in a particular context alter or generate new numeracy demands, new opportunities for learning and development, and may require different supports and may introduce new barriers for numeracy learning and development. So one of the co-authors of our paper, of our more recent paper on the Numerate environment, Jana. Jana was Jeff's PhD student, provided a really nice case study that illustrates this idea of the Numerate environment, because she was researching the transition of the national currency of Slovakia to the euro, because Slovakia joined the European Union. And so this was an example where the people of Slovakia all experienced new demands to be able to participate in their, you know, just their everyday consumer practices. There was therefore an opportunity for learning, you know, that involved strategies to convert from the old to the new currency or vice versa, estimating the value of a product or a service in the new currency, and then developing strategies that worked best for calculation and estimation in different contexts, because we do use different strategies for calculation and estimation depending on, you know, what it is that we're calculating and estimating. And Jana's study showed the range of support resources that were created and provided by the Slovak government to their citizens to facilitate their learning. And these included the supply of pre-programmed calculators to support adults wishing to produce exact conversions at any point. They also distributed conversion tables, giving equivalent numbers of euros and crowns. There were also displays of posters showing what items could be purchased for 10 euros, 20 euros, and so on, so people could get a feel for what, you know, so many euros could buy. And there were also local programs to help specific groups with limited access to information, including the elderly, the visually or hearing impaired, the economically vulnerable, the Roma people. And they used, you know, different strategies like drama and performing arts to help people make sense of this new currency. And there were also strategies in the form of, I guess, family numeracy. So they would engage children using hip hop music and rap to convey, you know, what this euro was all about and how to make sense of it, with the, I guess, assumption that they would then take that back to their homes and help their family members make sense of the euro. So this is an example where numeracy learning and development in the face of new demands on the whole population of Slovakia was understood by the Slovak government. They saw their public social responsibility to provide support resources to enable their citizens to take up the opportunity to negotiate the new demands placed on them, their consumer practices with the euro. And of course, barriers weren't completely absent. There were people who feared that, oh, you know, with this transition to the euro, people were going to hike up the prices, there's going to be inflation. And the government responded to those fears as well by developing some sort of code of ethics and monitoring, you know, what was happening, which then led to greater confidence in this whole endeavor. So I guess in wrapping up, the construct of the Numerate environment enables us to see how learning of skills and practices that really matter can emerge if we were to pay attention to the actual lived demands with which people are confronted. And we identify the opportunities for numeracy learning and development from these demands, and we provide supports and resources to enable people to take up these opportunities and to try to remove the barriers. And of course, you know, this can't happen overnight or very easily. It's not within, you know, the full control of, you know, teachers. It requires policies that support teachers to work really closely with communities and to develop, you know, authentic curricula that reflect the demands people are experiencing, rather than to use, you know, externally produced curricula or training packages to just supply the skills that some outsider or policymaker imagined are needed by, you know, the people. So I'll finish there, and then I'm just going to put up a couple of slides to help us move into the breakout rooms. So just bear with me. Can you see the slides? Yes, this is nodding, so.
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, so what we'd like you to do in your breakout rooms is just to remind yourselves of what we mean by this Numerate environment, the three lenses of looking at the demands, the opportunities for learning and development, and the supports and resources that are offered, or the barriers that exist. And then what we'd like you to do is, in your discussion groups that Don is going to magically put you into in a few minutes, we'd like you to consider any questions that have arisen for you about anything that David and I have said, and then perhaps reflect on the literate and or numerate environment in the context of this pandemic. We just thought if we get you to focus on the pandemic, it might help to put, you know, these ideas into something more concrete and specific. So I believe you're going to be in your breakout rooms for about 15 minutes. And so we suggest that, you know, somebody takes the role of a facilitator to, you know, keep you on track. And we'd also like somebody to take the role of a scribe to make note of the questions that emerge. And then when we come back to the whole group, we'll, you know, you might want to put the questions in the chat so we can look at them. But we'll also, I think, have the opportunity to invite you to share, you know, what you came up with in your discussions. But we can play that by ear. So any questions about what you're going to be doing? You ready to go? In which case, I think Don will push a button and you'll be invited to join a breakout room.
Liz,
Excellent. So we've got everybody back and lots more faces.
Should we put our comments?
Lucy, yes.
Yes, thanks. That'd be good.
Now? Okay.
Yeah, could exactly, Lucy, could everybody just go straight to the chat and start typing things in and not react to other people's? If you see somebody else's question that was similar to yours, make a comment, and then we'll just try and pick them up as we read them. So please type away. Of course, if somebody just wants to come on and ask the question with, you know, spoken words, that's also possible and encouraged. Now we can see more faces. Keiko, can I begin with that? Lucy's question there about PIAC and assessment.
Sure.
But I think it's a really interesting question because, yeah, there's a lot of criticism of PIAC and of what it tests and how it tests it. But when you look at the detail, when you read the conceptual framework of PIAC, it's a tremendously good job that they've done of trying to define and assess those skills. You know, and Jeff and Keiko know much better than me that some of the problems with those conceptual things, but they did a really good job of, you know, assessing those skills, identifying those skills, and then coming to some sort of agreement on how you could assess them across so many different international contexts, so many different languages. So in many ways, a hugely impressive thing. And what I think was expected was, as soon as that happened, this testing process would be made available. It was called PIAC Online at one stage. I'm not sure where they developed it, so that it could be used to assess our learners. And that hasn't come to pass, thankfully, because it's and partly because it's deeply problematic, because there's very little connection in a test like PIAC between the context of use, as Keiko was explaining, and the actual things that are assessed. So in terms of informing teaching, I don't think PIAC is very useful at all. I don't think it should inform the way we design a curriculum, because it starts from a deficit approach. It identifies what people can't do and then suggests that by equipping them with those particular things that they would not, that they would then be able to do these things. But we don't know what it is they're supposed to do with these skills. And until we know that, how can we assess how we can help them to do the things that they need to do? Unless we decide that everybody in the country needs the same thing, which is a top-down neoliberal approach, isn't it? Identify beforehand what people need and then go and equip them with it. And therefore that sort of assessment, I don't think, leads to very good curriculum design, because it's far too focused on deficits and far too focused on the individual, and doesn't take enough pay enough attention to the context. So I'm not sure that's helpful.
David, Jenny Bickmar Brands, read hers. We need a language of critique in maths. She gives the example of MasterChef.
Yep. No, very good, very good. I mean, yeah, the
Interesting comment.
PIAC has got literacy and numeracy, and also introduced the what they call problems. It wasn't problem solving, was it? It was, I can't even remember the term. Keiko.
Problem solving in technologically
Rich
environment. Yes.
Yeah, so they had this strange concept, which is basically doing stuff using a computer, sorting stuff out using a computer. I don't think it worked very well and it won't be replicated. But what it does imply that they were aware that there are other dimensions there than these discrete skills, and critical thinking is certainly one of them. That it doesn't test and it doesn't focus on that, and perhaps it couldn't do. Perhaps you couldn't focus on a test in that, and that then reveals what these things can't do for us. They can't necessarily assess all these things, and the idea that MasterChef gives you a new language for talking about, I presume talking about food, not talking about the presenters, but it gives you a new language to talk about food, doesn't it? And it gives all these ways of providing a stimulus around which you design the curriculum. Why not design a curriculum around MasterChef? In England, it'd be the Great British Bake Off that, you know, is huge potential for loads of learning to come out from a program like that. You know, it's obvious ones like measurement, but they're all the social skills and group work and planning and preparation, that these are very valuable curriculum resources. And because as educators, we can look and not just teach them the labels, not just say that's how you weigh flour. We can also talk about, you know, where flour comes from and who produces it, and why different flours cost different things, etc., etc., and what's inside flour. There's a whole curriculum within those things that people find interesting and stimulating. And criticality, I think, is really important.
David, Dorothy Zhang has got an interesting comment about ratios of participants to teachers and meeting the needs of learners and no assessment.
Well, I think that I can't see how the teacher's not assessing. Isn't the teacher just assessing constantly? There's no summative assessment, perhaps, and no formal diagnostic assessment, but I'd be very worried if the teacher wasn't assessing, because that's what teachers do with everything you hear, everything you listen to. You're processing, working out, have they got that? What do they need? How can I help them? And that's assessment. Just that it's a much broader, much more holistic assessment than perhaps something like PIAC could provide us. And therefore, yeah, it sounds a perfect, you know, the smaller the ratio, to a certain extent, the better. But I would certainly expect that teacher to be assessing. I don't know who said that. Is Dorothy want to come on and say what that assessment was or wasn't? Dorothy, I can see you.
I prefer not to say anything. I might have listened wrongly. I prefer not to say anything. Sorry.
No, it's not. It's an interesting comment. Very interesting comment, because what you're saying is that because there is a small group, the teacher can get to know them all, and therefore that assessment process is far more holistic and long-term, rather than it being a test to find out who these people are in 1 hour and then teach them, because you can get to know them, get to understand their needs through engagement.
David, perhaps it speaks to the idea that people have come to see assessment as being only about the sorts of summative assessments that are in these courses, these packages, as Keiko.
Really good point. Really good point. Yeah, I mean the idea that, you know,
assessment.
And also,
yeah, and I think that is a big thing that we've put in, that summative assessment, formative assessment, is, you know, distinct processes and the ones that have different outcomes and tools. Keiko, sorry.
no, it's okay. No, I was just going to say, I think what's happening in, well, not just adult literacy, I mean, it happens in universities, I mean, and schools where, you know, the whole teaching is assessment driven, this whole paradigm, I guess, of outcomes-based education And outcomes-based might be okay if the outcomes are determined by the learner, but what happens is that the outcomes are determined by, you know, somebody who doesn't have any relation with the actual learners. And then in order to, you know, justify the program, we need to show that, yep, these students have met, you know, these outcomes that have been set for them, tick, 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 and then that becomes the definition of a successful program. So, yeah, you know, whose outcome are we assessing against is, I think, something we need to think about.
Jenny Bickmore's got an interesting comment about Israel's new program to be used in 2030 by the OECD. Would someone like to, can you see that comment there?
Yeah, I saw that. I'm not aware of what the assessment is or what they're doing, but yeah, I'm certainly aware that OECD are interested in these higher order skills. It's a bit of a problem for them because they're, you know, they've worked out a way to very easily, or not very easily, very difficult to, but to measure, to get a measure of literacy and numeracy. Getting a measure of people's higher order skills is another, you know, another game really, and whether will ever be anything that's actually useful for us, because it strikes me that all it will do, it will boil it down to something that is demonstrable, something that you can do that shows that you've got higher order skills. Therefore, that thing will be taught, and everybody will do that to perform higher order skills. It's the nature of assessment. It's why, you know, it's a test. That's why our assessments have to really assess the things that we want people to be able to do. And if it's something that is not actually real, I don't think it'd be very helpful. Israel invented software that could transcend. The one answer only is correct. Capture values. Okay, I mean, it all sounds really interesting. Very, very interesting.
Maybe, should we, but perhaps Jenny, did you want to share more about that Israel program? Is that, oh no, okay. We discussed.
Thank you. Yes, I was sitting in Israel with a member of the OECD committee that's designing the maths, and it's such a shift in the way the maths testing would be. It's such a shift away that they're actually saying, I can't think of the lady's last name. Gila is her first name, and I think it's Gila Gur, but I can't remember the last name. I'm sorry. But she's basically saying that it's set for 2030 because it's going to take that long. And I was talking to her in 2018, take that long for everyone to catch up. But basically, it's like your Google search, if you like. You know, it finds phrases, it captures different versions, and then it's able to kind of moderate rather than just a kid getting an answer right or wrong. Or having to do one process and only one method is correct. So it certainly advances us beyond where we currently are. But you're right, it's all about context, and rich, saturated context is how we learn, and that's not going to be in a test.
Thanks for that, Jenny. Thank you. I'm just aware of the time, but we've got a lot of comments there. David?
I was wondering if Jeff's seen the comment from Lucy about the pandemic's effects on literacy and numeracy. I know Jeff's spoken a number of times about this, the fact that we're bombarded with graphs, big numbers, data tables. I don't know, Jeff, if there's something you could say on that.
No, I agree with both. It's a question of whether I think the second set of skills that she mentions will persevere. I think we are moving to online shopping to some extent irreversibly, or to a great extent. The graphs and bigger numbers, it'll be interesting to see if that perseveres, or if that if it isn't important any longer when we imagine that we've got over the pandemic, say in the way
we'll go back to ignorance.
Well, go back to not using really. I thought there was an interesting sort of challenge to all of us who teach numeracy from the previous comment, Greer's. There are too many different potential contexts to ensure numerical competence in all. Okay, I was thinking that was a challenge for a class. You know, if you've got everybody in with their own set of numerate environments, how do you resolve that in a session that only lasts an hour and a half? And that's where the genius of the teacher comes in, I think, to be able to manage that, to give time to maybe not everyone, but to the people who have the most developed sensitivity to their own numerate environment or literate environment.
The second part of a comment is interesting. And Jeff, I imagine you have something to say. That's why there was a push to develop generic skills to promote transferability. I know you've written about the idea of transferability.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think that there's a new book coming out, edited by Joe Lobato and her colleague from the States on transfer. It's just, about 6 months. And I think the idea of simple-minded transferability is dissolving. I think that it's being affected by the ideas that you and David put forward today about the dynamic characteristic of numerate environments. I think that idea has been a real breakthrough.
Jeff, Jeff, could I just come in there? I just wanted to go back to the point about online shopping and these changes and because I just think the environment concept's really helpful there, because everybody's environment, their literate environment, their numerate environment has radically changed in this odd period where we've been so much more online, and then while we've been online, and Lucy's got these two effects here, all the infographics from the pandemic, but also then our navigation of online learning, online shopping and online government services, all of these things. That's a real huge shift in our environment. And if we understand it as a literate environment and a numerate environment, then that's got to have significant impact on what people are being asked to do, what people are being expected to do. Or, and this is where the Keiko's description is so helpful, there are opportunities there in terms of online shopping. There are opportunities to inform yourself there, but there are lots of barriers to people accessing that information. So what are we doing as adult educators in order to support them to be able to interpret that information from themselves rather than somebody else explaining it to them, and for them to be able to act on that information that's available to them in their environment, but can they access it in the ways that we expect and we think is necessary for them and they think is useful for their lives. So the idea of the environment, yeah, it very much means looking at this group of 12 people, as Jeff said, that might mean 12 different contexts being brought in, but maybe not. And there's another question I just wanted to very briefly, Farhanda, somebody was mentioning about the potential for workplace literacy, language and numeracy to support this type of approach, because you immediately have got a very clear environment. You're dealing with plasterers, that's the environment, that's the context. You can identify the demands. You can identify what maths they need to do as a plasterer to do all of these things, and et cetera, et cetera. It's probably a trite example, but you can therefore work out what's the demand on that individual in order to become a plasterer, to qualify as a plasterer, to be a plasterer and do whatever plasterers need to do in terms of their businesses. Those are the demands on that person, and what opportunities are there for them to get out there and market their business or market themselves and get a job. And what's stopping them? Why can't they do that? Because perhaps they don't have these skills, but perhaps they just don't have the confidence. Perhaps they've never had the chance to have a go at doing that. Perhaps they've forgotten how to do certain things because they were never asked to once they were taught them at school. So all those things are opportunities to look at the environment, diagnose it, I suppose, analyze the environment, I suppose more. Diagnose is probably the wrong term at the moment, but to analyze the environment and work out what are these demands and supports and opportunities, and then facilitate that through adult education programs.
I think the online shopping example is an interesting one because you know, there's obviously the numeracy involved in, you know, shopping, but you know, one of the potential barriers is the issue of trust, you know, because we're all, you know, told to, you know, be careful about what you click on and where you go on the World Wide Web. And, you know, for people who, you know, are new to online shopping and, you know, so there's that, in a sense, the informal but important assessment of risk, you know, the probability of getting oneself into some sort of scam, I guess, that can be a very major barrier for some people. And when we are in a lockdown situation, it's not like you have somebody sitting next to you saying, no, what you have to watch out for is this, and this looks safe because blah, blah, blah. So I think there are opportunities, but the support resources may be very limited.
Yeah, that link to online shopping, someone's put in a link to an article about Woolworths. It must be a news article, commits 50 million to digital skills. Did you see that one? It's towards the end from Ruth. So the shopping companies are actually realizing that they need to be part of this community of part of, you know, they are in the environment and they need to put money into it as well, which is...
I was actually alluding more towards, they're quite sophisticated skills that they're talking about if you get to read the article. So what I'm concerned about is, in Victoria, we've talked a lot about the digital section of the ACSF now being quite significant. So the students need to be measured on their digital capacity as well. And I think when you delve into the ACSF now with the digital learning, we as educators probably need to be a lot more aware. And I think COVID has brought that out as well, a lot more on the ball with our digital skills. That article has got some really interesting things that young kids are learning, and these are the young kids that might not be able to read and write very well, but they're going to be learning these digital skills. So in some ways, yes, we're the literacy and numeracy educators, we probably have to keep abreast of some of these digital areas as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for that, Ruth. Thanks for that. Well, I'm really
always
aware
comes
of
out
the time, though. Oh, sorry, David. I'm just wanting to get a bit of a consensus of what do you want to do next, David, Jeff, and Keiko. Would you like to keep going for a bit longer, and you know, people could participate, or what's your?
I'm fine. I'm just sitting here in the kitchen, so. I'm not waiting for a train or a taxi. I'm just in the kitchen.
Okay. You're enjoying the contact with colleagues, aren't you? On the other
somebody to talk to.
side of the world. Okay. Well, we've got quite a few more.
Liz, can I say something about digital? Because I think this is, I mean, in the context of the pandemic, in England certainly, this has been, you know, another of the areas where it was always obviously true that there was unequal access to digital devices, not just to digital skills, unequal access to digital devices, unequal access to data to access those online learning. We knew that. It was always clear. In the pandemic and with the schools closed and school learning going online, It's just been made very, very visible. What hasn't been made visible is the lack of adults' digital skills, and perhaps lack of similar, physical barriers to accessing online services. There's a huge number of adults, I think, in all of our countries who just are not online. And they're not online mostly because they lack what we might call digital skills. Steve Reed has got a lovely concept where he says there's no point in teaching people digital skills until they've got digital taste. So until they realize what it can do for them, or how lovely it could be and how useful it could be, then they don't want to learn those skills, because why learn how to do this thing that I'm never going to do? So the first stage is obviously getting people taste, they want this thing. The pandemic, unfortunately, has been one of those moments where a huge number of people must have really wanted to be able to get online and wanted to be able to use Amazon and wanted to be able to check in with their local council to find out what the guidance was, but can't. And that seems to me that's created a moment that could be, really transformational if there was huge investment into, national programs of connecting these young kids, particularly who are really quite good with anything that's electronic. Connect them with the older generation who aren't. And also, it always comes down to economics. The more unequal our societies are, the more of a problem this becomes, because people living in different environments, they develop different practices. And those practices aren't just literacy and numeracy, they're cultural as well. So it can have a really significant impact on the way our societies work if we begin to develop our practices through entirely different environments. And it's not necessary. It's not necessary at all. And it does seem to have quite negative impacts. And is it something that is reasonably simple to address? We know how to do it. We just don't invest enough money in actually doing it. If we invested massively in adult education systems, we would have far more equal societies. We'd have far better access, and we'd know what people needed to learn because they'd tell us, because we'd have learner-centered systems and systems of listening to learners that allow us to identify what they want to do. So there's lots of opportunities there, and things like the pandemic, they do shine a really clear light on where things previously were rubbish, and they're still rubbish, and we need to address them.
Thanks for that, David. Well, look, much as it would be great to chat for a lot longer, we might need to wrap things up for this talk. Now, as I said in the chat, thank you so much for all your input here. It's a rich, a very rich resource for colleagues and for ACAL and for Keiko, Jeff and David as well. So thank you for your input, everyone. I'd like to again thank Keiko, Jeff and David for taking the time to come and share with us today and bring us all together. So thank you very much, everyone, and especially thanks to participants too, because you really share your ideas and share discussion with colleagues, and it's just a great opportunity to get together. And I hope we'll have plenty more of these sessions through the year and bring people from all around the world together to talk about numeracy and to keep pushing for this idea of getting into people's environments and really learning about what they need in the real world and in their everyday lives. So keep empowering people to build their strength with their numeracy. Okay, so thanks everyone again. And would you like to wrap up any last words, Keiko? You look like you want to.
Well, I'd just like to thank the opportunity to share our ideas with everyone. So thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks everyone for engaging with the ideas and raising questions, some of which we need to think more deeply about. It's really helpful to get your feedback. So thanks.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you.